Hi, everyone. So we find ourselves at chapter 34 and 35. These are the last two chapters we're covering. Remember, 31 and 32 were cut. That was just foreign exchange. And chapter 34 should be a review. So today's lesson will actually help a lot of people who have to do a retake on chapter 33. If you need to work on that test and those concepts, I really hope it'll be easy for you because it'll all come together. For everybody else, this will definitely be a review because we've already talked about monetary policy. We've already talked about aggregate demand. The language I've used, the way we've structured the class, the questions I've asked have really already brought all these issues out already. So there'll be a few new things, but really there'll be very little that's brand new for you. So, for example, you guys already know what monetary policy is. We're already talking about the Federal Reserve. They're tools of the Fed. You got open market operations, you got the discount rate, and you have reserve requirements. We've already talked about why the Fed is doing using these tools now and doing certain things now to help deal with the coronavirus. So we've already dealt with a lot of this stuff. So as we get into this, this really should be a review for you. So we've already talked about the long run impacts of monetary policy, and we've already learned that they're relatively limited. In the long run, the money supply, while set by the Fed, doesn't influence real production. And this actually goes back all the way to the Chapter 33 test because I asked you guys this question. I said, hey, what can the Fed do in the long run? And the answer is not much. While they can change the money supply around a little bit, that's just going to have inflationary impacts. It doesn't really affect things like technology, doesn't affect real production, it doesn't impact worker productivity directly. So all the effects in the long run all are indirect. And so in the long run, monetary policy is limited. However, in the short run, they can have impacts. And that's what the Fed is trying to do even today. They're trying to stimulate demand in our economy. They're trying to get people buying things again, even though a lot of things are closed. But, this is the reason why we've already talked about reserve requirements being lowered to zero. They're trying to use monetary policy in order to influence aggregate demand. The most common one is open market operations. So we've already talked about that. We've already talked about buy equals bigger, and of course, sell equals smaller. So the Fed is buying bonds, the commercial banks hold the bonds, the Fed is buying those bonds, and when they buy those bonds, they got to buy them with something, so they use money. Sounds good. And so they send the money out into the economy. So buy equals bigger. They increase the supply of money, and so the money supply line moves to the right. So and all this is doing is talking about how the Fed is changing in the short run now. In the short run, they can change aggregate demand. Now, remember, this is a review from Chapter 33. So, this is why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. Remember, you have on the y-axis, you have price level, and on the x, you have real GDP. So, the wealth effect just means at lower price levels, people feel wealthier. The interest rate effect is what we're going to be talking about now. So, when you hold things equal, as the price level will change, so will the interest rate. And so, while we already know what's going to happen with monetary policy and demand, we're going to talk about the interest rate effect a little bit more today. So the exchange rate effect, we don't really have to worry about, especially because that's been cut out. And even if it wasn't, it's a minor part of why the aggregate demand curve slopes downward. Because remember, net exports has a very small impact on overall aggregate demand anyway. So we'll take a quick look at the interest rate effect today. Now, over here. And let me move this. So we have the theory of liquidity preference. I've already mentioned this to you, and I did that on purpose so that when we got here, it would be relatively a review for you. So we already know that the opportunity cost of holding money is the interest rate. So on this graph here, we see we have money demand as the downward sloping line. We have quantity of money and it's set. So we have the interest rate on the y-axis and QM on the x. So if you take a look at a point labeled E2, that's at equilibrium. The interest rate and the amount of money in circulation, they all are in equilibrium. Everything's set, everything's fine. But there is disequilibrium at point E1 and there is disequilibrium at point E3. So note that the vertical line represents the money supply, and that's set by the Fed. So this is a little different than a regular supply line. It doesn't move back and forth as easily. So instead, we could have a disequilibrium at E1. And that's just not going to be changed by automatically like the Fed changing the money supply. It doesn't work that way. So what will happen at E1 is that the interest rate will be very high. And we've already discussed what would happen because the opportunity cost of holding money is your interest rate. So if the interest rate is very high, then what will happen is more people will say, hey, I want to save my money. And so they're going to not demand as much money. They're going to put their money into the bank. And so this will put downward pressure on the interest rate. Now, we've graphed this a little bit in more detail with a loanable funds graph. I'm not going to do that right here, but I'm just going to show you that if the interest rate is very high, it's not the quantity of money that changes, it's the amount of money that people are going to be holding. And so as our supply of loanable funds is moving to the right, which isn't on here, but we've discussed that last chapter or last unit about what's going to happen, the quantity of money and the interest rate will change from E1 down to E2. So people will decide that the interest rate is very high, and so they're going to save their money. On the converse side, if you take a look at E3, there the interest rate is low. So there's going to be upward pressure on the interest rate because people will choose to hold money because there's no downside to holding it. So people will choose to hold money as cash. And so they'll just leave it in their pocket. This could actually decrease the supply of loanable funds and it'll move the interest rate up to E2. So the way I'm talking about it now, you don't actually have to change the quantity of money set by the Fed. What's happening is your interest rate is controlling what people are doing with their cash. Now, that's going to be very important. And so that's going to be very important because we're looking at now the overall impact of these interest rates changes on the overall aggregate demand of the economy. So, as we mentioned, as people hold dollars, what do they give up? They give up the interest earned. So, now we're going to determine our interest rate. And we have our interest rate set as R1, and we have a money supply graph here. And then we have, of course, it's being vertical. Changes in R don't affect the money supply. Remember, that's set by the Fed. Money demand, as we know, fall in R increases money demand because people, the interest rate is so low, people have no problem holding money. So let's take a look at what's happening here once we set our two graphs together. We have on the right, we have an aggregate demand. Now, I'm only showing the aggregate demand, even though it's aggregate demand and supply. I'm only showing the aggregate demand line. And on the left, we have a regular money market graph. So here's how the interest rate effect works. And remember, I said we're going to talk about this effect and its impact on aggregate demand. So step number one. What we have is we have everybody at R1 and P1. Remember, P1 is the price level. But let's say the price level falls. A falling price level means that inflation has fallen. If inflation falls, people don't need to hold as much cash. This is just like your grandparents would say, "Oh, that used to cost a nickel." Well, now things don't cost a nickel; they cost more, so we need to hold more cash. Well, if the opposite was true, if price level fell, then we wouldn't need to hold as much cash, and we'd all be carrying nickels again. So price level falls, this reduces the demand for money. So money demand then also falls. Now, since MS is stable because that's set by the Fed, the thing that changes is the interest rate. So the interest rate falls. As the interest rate falls, what happens? All right. So a fall in R increases investment and the quantity of goods and services demanded. So what we have here now is something we've already talked about. We have a falling interest rate. Everything else is being held the same, but price level is changing. So what we have here is not a stable price level. we have a falling price level. So since we have a falling price level, what we have is an increase in the quantity of goods and services demanded. So let me just walk that back and go through it again. So we're going to start here, equilibrium. Then we have a falling price level. The falling price level means people don't need to hold as much money. So money demand falls. As money demand falls, that drives the interest rate down because people aren't holding their cash. And the fallen R, because R is your interest rate, now increases investment. And so because the price level fell from P1 to P2, the quantity, the real GDP, is going to increase from Y1 to Y2. In your textbook, you can also find this graph, and so you could take a look at it. I think it's, let me take a look. I think it's figure 2. Yes. So you could take a look. It's the opposite situation, but on 763, you could take a look at that and see what's happening there. Now, this continues monetary policy and aggregate demand. So, to achieve macroeconomic goals, of course, we know the Fed can use monetary policy to shift the aggregate demand curve. Fed's policy instrument is money supply. They're always changing the money supply. Now, we've already talked about this, and now this is old hat because we've seen this and it's happening in the news. But the Fed is often targeting the federal funds rate. Right now, given the situation, it's basically at 0. And they're trying to stimulate demand. So, all of this is happening. Now, the Fed can also increase the interest rate. So if the Fed wants to, and we've done these before, but now we're just throwing in the aggregate demand graph so we see it, reduction in the money supply raises the interest rate, reduces the quantity of goods and services demanded. Boom, there you go. So that's it. You guys should already know this stuff. We got a couple of quick examples here, and then you're good to go. So if Congress, we'll take a look at output here, take a look at what the Fed should do. But what we have here is Congress tries to balance the budget by cutting government spending. So if that's what Congress does, what will the Fed do? In letter B, we'll take a look at a stock market boom, increasing household wealth. And in letter C, we'll take a look at war breaking out in the Middle East, causing oil prices to soar. So in each one of these situations, what will be the short run impact on output and what should the Fed do? So in letter A, if Congress tries to balance the budget by cutting government spending, this event would reduce aggregate demand and it would reduce output. So to stabilize output, the Fed should increase the money supply. They're going to buy bonds. This will reduce R, reduce the interest rate, and it will cause an aggregate demand increase. In the stock market boom, if that increases household wealth, this could, of course, create an inflationary gap. So output would be above the natural rate. Fed needs to reduce the money supply and increase R, and that will reduce aggregate demand. If war breaks out in the Middle East, causing oil prices to soar, this could actually cause stagflation. It could also reduce AD as well, but we certainly have falling output. So to stabilize output, the Fed should increase the money supply and reduce the interest rate to increase aggregate demand. So that's it. This is not everything in Chapter 34, but it's much of what we're going to start with, and I hope a lot of that made sense and it was a review.